Chapter 3, Emotional Pain. It seems like it would have been an absurdity to discuss emotional pain without a long exposition on physical pain to lay the groundwork. Emotional pain, as it turns out, is physical pain, at least so far as our brains are concerned. Emotions do not activate nociceptors in our skin, but are processed by the same parts of the brain that process physical pain. Perhaps if before getting very deeply into emotional pain, it would help to understand what emotions are. Part of us. Emotions are essential parts of our cognition. It is impossible to separate emotions from reason. Unlike Vulcans or androids, if we were to think with no regard to what we felt, we would become less rather than more logical. Especially in the West, we tend to identify ourselves as what we think in language in the conscious part of our minds. But the vast majority of what you think and even do occur below the threshold of consciousness. Emotions are not events that happen to people any more than our thoughts and words. You do not have anger, you are angry. Your cognition, your thoughts and words are entangled with the feelings that you have. Take a complex emotion such as love. Love is not a universal emotion and is difficult to describe or define. Love varies by context. You love your children differently than you love your parents. You love your sports team differently than your romantic partner. You love cheeseburgers differently than you love your figure of worship. And other emotions occur in the presence of love. While it's very difficult to be angry and happy at once, it's quite easy to love someone while being disappointed in them or afraid for them. Love is not one feeling that occurs all the time, but the context in which other feelings happen, the context that motivates other feelings or actions. This might be what emotions really are, the context of cognition. You think sadder thoughts when you're sad, remember sadder things and forget the happier ones. Sadness is more than a temporary state or an experience that occurs in no context. Sadness is part of us, part of our unified experience of memory, our values, our context, our thoughts, and more. Later, we will revisit sadness in particular as an emotion we tend to attack and the consequences of attacking something that is essentially us. We're not born as blank slates, and nor are we born fully ready to live as adults. We are overspecified for learning, however, particular kinds of learning. Language and culture we pick up with astounding ease, especially when we're young. Even the unspoken rules of society are relatively painless for us to master. Emotions and their expression come along relatively early in our development and refine throughout the lifespan. Daniel Siegel points to attachment as a primary way our emotional lives and neurology are eased through early development. That is, what and how we feel and how our brains develop are in part products of our early relationships. Sigmund Freud would not be surprised to hear it. There are just a few emotions whose expressions are more or less universal. They include interest, anger, happiness, sadness, fear, and disgust. Even these have to be read through the lens of culture. They do not include the loftier things we say we feel, such as inspiration or love. The more basic and universal an emotion, the less it is a product of the culture in which we live or the environment in which we were raised. The less basic, the more refined an emotion, the more it is a product of our individual history rather than the history of our genes. Culture specific behaviors. Even the more basic emotions are influenced in their expression by the time and place in which we arise. Take anger as an example. Every person in every culture experiences anger to some degree. Someone in Bolivia Seeing an angry person from Romania would immediately recognize the expression on their face. However, culture gives us powerful messages about how and whether to act out that emotion. In the US, it is far more acceptable and expected for men to be angry than women, and more acceptable for men to express that anger in certain ways, particularly at work. We have special words for women who express their anger like men do, and none of them are positive. Most, in fact, are profane and not to be repeated here. There are consequences for these double standards of emotional expression. Men learn to express their anger mostly through their gender appropriate models, their fathers, uncles, cousins, men on television. Women do the same through their own gender appropriate models, mothers, sisters, aunts, etc. Women are strongly discouraged from masculine expressions of anger and are modeled anger as sadness. It's more acceptable for women to be sad than angry. And here is some bias against men who are as discouraged from experiencing and expressing sadness as are women from anger. Boys don't cry. It is possible for two people to experience depression and look completely different to the diagnosing clinician. And we'll have more to say about the existence of mental illness and depression later. Nothing like a good controversy to sell books. A female patient is likely to present the way lay people would expect a depressed person to act. Crying, inactivity, changes in weight, feelings of sadness they can report and describe. A man is not as likely to present this way. Men are more likely to keep going to work, more likely to be referred by others, such as unhappy supervisors or legal authorities, and more likely to be irritable than sad. They might not report any sadness at all, confusing sadness for anger. The depressed man might not spend any extra time in bed and might never cry. The subjectivity of emotions makes them difficult to study and makes it difficult to help people whose emotional experiences are causing them to suffer. That culture dictates how, when, and whether we are permitted to express certain things, to what degree, and even what about. Think of John Boehner eliciting ridicule for his emotionality about the Constitution. And all of that makes the waters extremely muddy. Money makes the waters not just muddy, but turbulent. Scientists have some pretty deep divisions studying more or less objective facts like astronomy and physics and chemistry. Imagine how much deeper the divisions might be when we discuss value laden and obviously subjective things like people's emotions. Our values get in the way of our investigations at the very start by affecting the sorts of questions that we ask, are capable of asking. Take the case of hysteria. Up until the early years of the last century, it was perfectly acceptable to denounce basically any female behavior that was nonconforming as problems with her uterus. When the woman's uterus quivered, it made her irrational. Displays of anger or sadness, or really any emotion, and certainly any kind of irrationality, as defined by men with an especially narrow view of rationality, could get the woman confined to a mental institution. Once there, she could have her uterus removed without her consent as a cure for her madness. While we have mostly done away with the idea that the uterus causes mental problems, except in the stand up comedy circuit, our view of emotionality remains deeply sex stereotyped. And while our prejudices have evolved, they've also become more refined and insidious. Chemical imbalances and profitable. A distinctly modern conceit is the idea that everything is biological. Now, at a certain level, this is inarguable. We have no behaviors for which we lack genes and no behaviors for which we lack biology. Imagine laughing with no lungs or diaphragm. Impossible. The conceit is not just that emotions are biological, it is that they are only biological, and that biology is the origin of emotions. Thus, the person experiencing schizophrenia is thought to have these experiences due to some chemical imbalance in their brain, and the solution to the problem is said to be rebalancing the chemicals. There are many problems with this theory, not the least of which is that it just doesn't hold up in practice. Schizophrenia is absolutely the most biologically based of the so called mental illnesses and is no more than 50% genetic. Among identical twins raised separately, a twin with schizophrenia is just under 50% likely to have this condition in common with their twin. There's some evidence that these results pointed some genetic complexity behind the disorder. There has to be some environmental trigger to activate the genes underlying the condition, and that trigger remains elusive. Schizophrenia is thought to be a problem of dopamine production. The reasons behind that thought, though, seem primarily to be reasons of profit motive. In 1950, the first effective medical treatment for schizophrenia came on the market under the trade name Thorazine. Thorazine is a dopamine antagonist, meaning it fills receptor sites in the brain where dopamine should lodge. This slows the effects of the natural dopamine made by the brain. Clinical trials showed enough effect from this drug to approve it as a treatment for schizophrenia. But this leads to an assumption. Too much dopamine causes schizophrenia. While an advance on previous theories of schizophrenia, which largely involve blaming the mother, there's a mistake here, a big one. It is the confusion of correlation with causation. If we measured wealth and age, we would find that money tends to accumulate around old people. We would not, though, assume that wealth causes age. For some reason, almost certainly money, when we find these correlations in clinical trials, we leap immediately to causation. Now, remember back to the argument about evolutionary psychology. Recall the elaborate and widely accepted explanation for sex differences in promiscuity. Recall also that the sex differences the theory attempted to explain were actually artifacts of the way we asked the questions. In other words, imaginary. Here we have an identical problem. Clinical trials actually have quite a low threshold of effectiveness to meet. A low percentage of these test subjects need to show improvement, far from every test subject. Additionally, few test subjects need to show harmful side effects, and none very severe side effects. In practice, antipsychotics like Thorazine and the 100 other very profitable products that have followed it are not actually very effective. And as the patents begin to run out on those old compounds, even the people who make them begin to disavow their effectiveness in favor of supporting newer antipsychotics with equally dubious scientific support. In the industry, we broadly acknowledge the rule of thirds. About 1/3 of people recover from their first psychotic break with no further intervention needed, no drugs used. About a third wind up taking antipsychotic drugs for the rest of their lives, with fair to excellent control of symptoms and mild to fatal side effects. And for about a third of people experiencing psychosis, the symptoms do not yield to any treatment. Not antipsychotics, not talk therapy, nothing. There is not strong statistical support for the rule of thirds at this time, but it does point to the general inefficacy of the current medical system of treatment. That does not mean that their conditions could never respond to any therapy, just that the things we are doing now, under the assumption that their problems are caused by neurochemistry, are not helpful. Making things even more complicated are the data about people who improve, if not recover completely, through means that do not involve adjustments to brain chemistry. In cultures that cannot afford dedicated psychiatric hospitals, incidents of schizophrenia are essentially the same as in the US, but the symptoms and severity vary. People still contribute to their societies because societies cannot afford their loss just because they're different. Even here, we find that the more we can keep people involved in work and in healthy relationships, the less their symptoms are very bothersome. If we do not discard our eccentrics, their eccentricities remain within a less harmful range on average. In summary, medications for psychosis are the effective origins of the biochemical theory of mental illness. The studies showing these initial links are more correlation than causation studies, and those studies are very dubious for the purposes to which they're being put in this context. Finally, we're ignoring all sorts of evidence that interventions at a non biochemical level might be useful. What does all this have to do with emotions? Depression's a nearly identical case. The first real evidence that depression is caused by imbalances in brain chemistry comes from drug studies. Once drugs were approved for the treatment of depression, they became very profitable, as did studies that found them effective. In short, corruption is endemic to such studies. As with antipsychotics, a major problem for pharmaceutical companies at this time is the expiring patents on antidepressants. Unsurprisingly, as the patents expire, the effectiveness of antidepressants decline. Some researchers attempt to explain this as improvements in methodology, but this might have as much to do with focus shifting away from these drugs and onto new ones. 20% of mid career researchers admitted in one study to changing their methodology under pressure from funding sources. Absent this meddling, newer studies can be more honest and effective. Actually, I was just back in that source literally yesterday, and the number was 15 point something, like 15.5%, not 20%. Anyway, antidepressants modified the activities of all sorts of brain chemicals called neurotransmitters. Because modifying the actions of these neurotransmitters seems to change the severity of symptoms of depression, we jump to the conclusion that the depression itself is caused by imbalances in these chemicals. But there are plenty of alternative explanations available, particularly in the light that drugs for depression are even less effective than drugs for schizophrenia. For example, a study published in the 2010 Journal of the American Medical Association found that for all but the most serious cases of depression, no chemical treatment was better than placebo. So taking a sugar pill your well liked doctor said would help you would in fact help you, as well as the compounds offered by drug companies, unless you were one of the most depressed people in the study. We are very ready to believe such explanations. After all, we live in such a culture of convenience where we see no profit in tolerating discomfort. Food, coffee, movies, heat, and transportation on demand are all endemic. We can cure a headache with a pill, cure the consequences of our indiscretions with pills, from antibacterials to antacids. Why cannot we cure our hard feelings with pills? Why shouldn't we? Here's a very difficult case to make, and I frequently upset people by making it. People get attached to the labels their doctors use to describe them, whether those labels are attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or depression or bipolar or whatever else. Even I carefully describe myself as experiencing autism. They feel attacked when I point out these errors in the science behind these conditions and their treatment. But what I am not saying, and explicitly not saying, is that individual people should stop treatments that are helping them, that drugs are useless or evil, or that people have absolute control and thus responsibility for their emotions and mental process. I am saying, and saying so explicitly, that profit motives have occluded the science and that many more people than actually benefit from drugs are taking them. You decide for yourself whether you're one of those people. Back to the science. Correlation does not imply causation. Adding free serotonin to the brain improves depression for just enough people that the FDA feels like it can approve a drug. This is actually a really small number of people, not even a majority, and the effect is only measurable in very severe cases of depression. From here, we make the assumption that depression is caused by a lack of free serotonin in the system, but why not make an alternative assumption? The brain reacts to conditions in the world. For example, sad thoughts activate sad emotions. Sad emotions reduce free serotonin. We can temporarily reverse those emotions with chemistry, which temporarily reduces these sad thoughts. But the conditions in the world that created those conditions in the brain have not been altered. Ultimately, these adjustments to brain chemistry must be ineffective, perhaps even inappropriate. Indicators of values. To put it another way, what if we are sad because our lives are unsatisfying? Let's say you're a fairly typical US American, and therefore your self worth and identity are wrapped up in your work identity. You've been in public affairs for 40 years and are suddenly made redundant by a failing economy. You have trouble getting so much as polite rejections from potential employers and find yourself in some menial occupation older than all the workers around you struggling to pay bills. This was the case for a client of mine, a man in his 50s, whose actual complaint was not depression, but emotional side effects from a medicine he was taking. He found himself pushed out of his profession as companies hired exclusively attractive young women, marginalizing the men like him who were older, more experienced, but who did not look as good on camera. He was a PR man. It was a new experience for him, having been in the dominant group all his life, to suddenly experience discrimination, ageism, and sexism. He handled it well, to my mind. I was hesitant to ascribe his feelings to medication side effects because the feelings he had were really appropriate to his situation. Even if I had the power to prescribe a medicine to relieve his sadness, would that be appropriate? Think about this. Would you want to work in a profession for decades, be suddenly marginalized from that field, and feel nothing about it? Sadness and disappointment seem normal, natural, and even helpful. We could look at anxiety in just the same way. Anxiety is usually a signal that something is wrong. We fix what's wrong and the anxiety goes away. Imagine your bills are coming due and you're not certain you have the money to cover them. Should you take a pill to kill the anxiety? Or is the anxiety helpful? It can certainly help us be careful with our money until we resolve all the bills. Sometimes my students complain of anxiety about taking our final exam or giving their presentation. At least once a term, I try to have this conversation with them. It's good to be anxious, provided the anxiety is not running or ruining your life. Take a moment to express gratitude to the anxiety. It is the anxiety causing you to study harder, to make sure your references are spot on, to practice your presentation. If you did not care about the test enough to feel anxious, you probably would not care enough to study either, and then you might fail it. Worrying about failing is our best defense against failing. Our emotions reveal and express our values. My client was sad about losing his profession because he cared about his profession and the people in it. And he cared about himself, knew he did not deserve to be cast aside after decades of loyalty, a condition more and more familiar in the American workplace. We are expected to remain loyal to our employers, but can expect no loyalty from them. The world is a depressing place. It would be hard to argue the opposite with much conviction, although certainly we can find good things about living. Optimism is in many ways self delusion. Depressed people and pessimists tend to die younger and are sick more, but they can console themselves with the fact that they tend to be right more often, more realistic about the world around them. New research, though, is showing our former assumptions might have colored our studies, and that actually pessimists live longer by insulating themselves from unnecessary risks. Uh, let's take a break just for a second. Over the years, this is somewhat clarified. Is the depressed people die younger thing, pessimists die younger thing, is worried people who have heart disease, and it's best if you can get people not to worry if they have heart disease. So worry warts and pessimists seem like they die more of heart attacks under certain conditions, but die less of all other causes, you know? Because if you can catch a pessimist on a motorcycle, they're wearing a helmet. And if they must go skydiving, then they've packed their own chute and checked it twice, right? Okay, back into the book. It is not just the employment scene that's depressing, and this is not the only place where our feelings express our values. When one cries at a funeral, this is an expression of love for the deceased. We cry in proportion to the love we held and still hold for the dead person, at least when we cry with sincerity. It might not be surprising then that professional mourners have existed in our culture and persist in many others. All the wailing and carrying on confers status to the deceased, expresses love for them. What makes you angry? The things that get your goat express your values. Is it bad grammar? Poor manners? People who drive slowly on the interstate? The way women are exploited in media? What makes you laugh or cry? What are you afraid of? It might not take too much imagination to be informed by such feelings if we take the time to listen closely and think about them. What you say you value is sometimes confirmed by your emotions and translated into actions, and sometimes it is given lie by your feelings and behaviors. That's it for now. Back with treating emotions in part two.